Hello, student. You may remember that I cannot be in class today because I have to go to the United Kingdom for my graduation ceremony. So what we're going to do is have the lectures in this format. And so what's going to happen is we are beginning our third and final unit for the course, the early modern period. And you may be wondering, well, what does the early modern period mean? What does early modern mean? As far as time is concerned, we're talking about roughly 1500 to roughly 1800. So this period that came after the European Middle Ages and the post-classical period elsewhere. During this period, a lot of important things were happening in Europe that really changed it forever and really made Europe much different than what it had been during the Middle Ages. People in Europe began to move away from a religiously dominated society into one that was more secular, movement toward the secular state. That was beginning to happen in Europe during this period of time. With the Renaissance, people started to actually think more secularly, although that does not mean that people still did not think about religion or the church or God or anything like that. And on that note, something else that's very interesting to point out is Christianity in Western Europe became divided forever during the early modern period. Maybe you've heard of the Protestant Reformation before. Well, with Luther and Calvin and Henry VIII and the Church of England, Protestant churches formed that broke off from the Roman Catholic Church and the papacy, and there was no longer one Catholic Western Europe. There were now Protestant groups of Protestants and the Catholic Church, two different forms of Christianity in the West. People in Western Europe were also becoming more and more interested in science, and science in the more modern sense. So maybe you've heard of how people thought previously that the world was the center of the universe. For the longest time, people in Europe thought that the world was the center of the universe, but people discovered, that the sun is actually the center of the universe, and that really changed the way people looked at themselves, the way they looked at the world. Again, a time of great change for Europe. Something else that's important to point out is this was also the time when the world became more interconnected than it had ever been before and was starting to become more globalized. That's a term we keep throwing around nowadays, globalization. Well, as the Europeans expanded into the Americas, as they made themselves more well known in the Far East with China and Japan, it really changed the way the world worked and the way the different civilizations in the world interacted. So more on all of this later. But today what we're going to do is focus on the Renaissance, one of the movements in Western Europe that would forever change the way people in Europe looked at themselves and the world in which they lived. And we're talking about a movement from roughly 1300 to roughly 1600. And I imagine that the Renaissance is something that you have heard of before. And most people think of the art, they think of the work of Leonardo, maybe the Mona Lisa or the Last Supper, or maybe the Sistine Chapel, all of these great glorious works of art. That certainly was an important part of the Renaissance, but not all that there was to it. We'll see that people were very interested in the language and literature of the ancient world, and that there were other developments too in Italy and beyond. And I imagine that you've seen references to the Renaissance in pop culture, whether whether you've seen the Mona Lisa show up in movies or in magazine articles, or maybe you're familiar with the Ninja Turtles franchise that began in the 1980s. The four Ninja Turtles are named after four of the great artists of the Italian Renaissance. So Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, and Donatello. As we begin our survey of the Renaissance, what we want to do is explore how it began. We want to do that for just a few minutes. And that term, Renaissance or Renaissance in the French, means rebirth. That's what it means. So the question becomes, the rebirth of what? And the answer is the rebirth of the culture and heritage of Greco-Roman antiquity, the rebirth of the classical world in Europe. People during the Renaissance wanted to make classical antiquity the model for their late medieval and early modern present. So draw on what the ancients did in order to make their own world better. And the Renaissance began in Italy. And there are a few different reasons why. One being the Italians had a lot of money. There were powerful rulers here, like the popes. There were people with lots of money, like the Medici in Florence, who began as bankers and ended up becoming the Dukes of Tuscany. There's also the reality that, if you've traveled to Italy, any of you, it doesn't take you too long, whether you're in Milan in the north, or Naples in the south, or Rome in between. There are ruins of the ancient world all over the place that people could go see and study and experience. And so the ancient world was still evident even 1,000 years after it had ceased to exist. And the Renaissance became a big deal throughout Italy. Remember that when we talk about Italy now, while that is the region, the area that we're talking about, we should probably be talking about the Italies, because there were numerous Italian states at the time: the Kingdom of Naples, the Republic of Florence, the Republic of Venice, the Papal States, so on and so forth. It would take a long time for them to become one Italy. That wouldn't happen until the 19th century. But anyway. The first thing that we want to mention about the Renaissance is humanism. Humanism is the program that emphasized the study of the form and content of classical learning. Those people who went on to become humanists were interested in going back to the culture of antiquity and, as I mentioned earlier, apply it in the late medieval and early modern present, because they were convinced it would help improve society. It would make people better at what they did, better human beings. And those who were interested in humanism studied a few different areas of what we would call now the humanities. So the liberal arts, of course, but particularly important were the languages of classical antiquity. So Greek, but especially Latin. That's what the humanists in Western Europe were mostly interested in, Latin. Bringing back and reviving the Latin that the people such as Julius Caesar and Cicero and others spoke. Humanists were also interested in classical documents. They had a motto, ad fontes, that's Latin for to the sources. So they were interested in getting right back there to those ancient documents, studying them, and making them relevant again. The first humanist that we're going to introduce was a man named Francesco Petrarch, a 14th century figure, an Italian, and one of the greatest of the humanists. He lived during the Middle Ages, but let me tell you, he despised his time. He could not stand the Middle Ages. He thought it was backward. He was very upset with the religious situation. There were a lot of problems going on with the papacy, corruption in the church. He was not pleased. And a lot of what he wanted to do was to sort of escape the Middle Ages and look back to the classical world. And so every opportunity he had, he sought to encourage the revival of the classics. He himself wrote a great deal and even wrote in the classical Latin style. So he made it a point to write just like the ancients had written Latin. And he was responsible for a great poem about the Punic Wars called Africa. And people were so enthusiastic about this poem that they invited him to Rome and crowned him poet laureate. If you're looking at the PowerPoint presentation, you'll see that Petrarch is wearing that funny wreath around his head. That's the laurel wreath. So that is a sign of his esteem and how important his works as a humanist were and how important they were deemed. Petrarch was one of these figures that also went on searches for ancient manuscripts and was able to bring some back to light that people had forgotten about and that had been lost. So someone who definitely contributed a great deal to humanism. Another humanist was a man named Lorenzo Valla, another Italian. He was very, very strong when it came to languages, the ancient languages. And he was so knowledgeable of Latin and the history of Latin that when he was confronted with a document that had been authoritative for centuries called the Donation of Constantine, he was able to determine that it was not an authentic document, but a fraud. So the Donation of Constantine purported to be something that Constantine the Great, I bet you remember his name from our survey of early Christianity, the emperor that granted toleration to the Christians and became a Christian himself. The church had this document that was supposed to have come from him in which he was bequeathing to the papacy territory in Western Europe, so giving the popes secular authority and territory formerly ruled by the secular government. So this document was a sort of giving the church justification for the authority it wielded. Well, Lorenzo Valla looked at the Latin of the document and he said, hey, wait a minute. I know what Latin has looked like throughout the centuries, and the Latin in this document does not reflect the kind of Latin that Constantine and people from the 3rd century would have used. Everyone, this isn't authentic. This is a forgery. And so that's what he exposed it as. So people now understood that the Donation of Constantine had not come from the emperor himself. Instead, it came from the early Middle Ages. Something else that's interesting to point out about civic humanism is that some of these people interested in the classics were determined to bring their knowledge and their understanding of ancient culture into their own time in the public sphere, in government. So for them, humanism wasn't just a private affair, a contemplative pursuit for people such as Petrarch. Instead, they wanted to take what they knew and bring it out in order to promote their countries, their cities, whatever, whether it be Florence or Venice or whatever. These people were interested in trying to inspire virtuous men to get involved with their government and with their communities. And they stressed the morality and the ethics reflected in classical Roman documents about Roman virtues in connection to the state, self-sacrificing service to the state, and then also the virtues discussed in the Christians' sacred texts. So these were important for the civic humanists, and this is what we call this aspect of humanism, civic humanism. But not everybody wrote about those ideas. So a lot of these civic humanists were interested in the ideal, what people should be doing. One writer from the Renaissance who described what people actually did was a man named Niccolò Machiavelli. Maybe you've heard the name Machiavelli before. Maybe you've heard the adjective Machiavellian, which may conjure up images of ruthless, bloodthirsty, gangster-like leaders and rulers. And there's sort of a reason why, which we'll get into in just a few minutes. Machiavelli was a very important politician in the city of Florence, the Republic of Florence. He served as Chancellor of the Republic, so a leadership position in the Republic of Florence, and as such, he spent a great deal of time traveling on behalf of the Florentine people, the Florentine government. And as he traveled and as he met people, he watched and observed how politicians really went about conducting their business. And it was not always pretty what he saw and what he learned. But these contacts, these opportunities to interact with these particular individuals gave him a lot of experience. He was a worldly man who understood how the world actually worked. And he reflects these ideas in his book called The Prince, published in 1513. The Prince is sort of odd in the sense that Machiavelli was a staunch Republican. The man believed in the principles of a republic. We've already talked about what a republic was with Rome. But the Prince was a manual for despots, rulers, on how to gain and maintain their power. And Machiavelli taught in this book, you know what, princes, rulers, there are times where you may have to behave immorally in order to keep your power and to get what you want. You may have to lie. You may have to cheat. You may have to assassinate and murder. He was very clear that these were things people might have to do and be prepared to do them. He emphasized that the prince should be like the lion on the one hand. A lion, of course, is a strong, ferocious beast. And he stressed that the ruler, the prince, ought to be intimidating like a lion so that he could intimidate his enemies. But then again, the ruler, the prince, should be like the fox. The fox is a cunning, smart, clever animal. So Machiavelli stressed that rulers should be like the fox as well, to be cunning, to avoid the traps of their enemies. Machiavelli emphasized that virtue in politics was really ambiguous. You know, the Bible and all of these wonderful documents from the ancient world may talk about honesty and virtue and self-sacrifice and all of that stuff. But you know what? In some cases, if you are honest and do what is right, you may lose your power. Whereas if you do what's wrong, you lie, you cheat, you may be able to keep your power. So really, the prince is an example of political realism, not political idealism. Machiavelli was not interested in the way things should be. He described how things really were out there in the world. And please feel free to comment below if you have any questions as we're going along. But for the meantime, let's continue on. Now let's think about art and architecture, for which the Renaissance is most famous. Before we talk about the Renaissance artists and architects, it's important to get a sense of what people were doing with art during the Middle Ages. We've already seen how the Gothic style, we were scheduled to talk about Gothic architecture but did not quite get there. Gothic architecture was the style of architecture very important in Western Europe during the Middle Ages, known for its soaring spires, pointed arches, stained glass windows, and whatnot. So that was common during the Middle Ages. As far as art was concerned, most of the subjects depicted in sculpture and painting were religious and focused on themes from the Bible or themes from the lives of saints. That's what medieval artists were concerned with. And when artists, when painters did their work in particular, they imitated the Byzantine style of painting. You can see the Madonna and Child on the screen here. Take a look at that. That's a great example of the Byzantine style. Do you see how stiff and solemn both the Christ child and the Virgin look? Okay, so there's nothing warm here. They're very frontal. They look very placid and solemn. There is not a great deal of emotion. Take a look at the space. It looks very flat, doesn't it? A very shallow understanding of space. And then there's the golden sky in the background. When we look outside, of course, there are no golden skies, but people depicted the sky as golden in the Byzantine style, not because that's how things look in nature, but because it was supposed to get people thinking about the world to come, heaven. And this style of art, that people did art this way, doesn't make that style of art bad. Really, there's just a different attitude behind it. Now, as far as what Renaissance artists were trying to accomplish, unlike what we just saw with the Byzantine style, Renaissance artists wanted to depict nature as it really appears. So, for example, blue skies, not golden ones. Renaissance artists were also interested in creating the illusion of space in their art. They were able to do this by means of linear perspective. So with linear perspective, even though artists, painters in particular, were working with a two-dimensional plane, they were able to create the sense of 3 dimensions. You see that picture on the screen? How we have the trees there? When we look out into the real world, trees that are closer are always larger. Trees that are farther away are always smaller, right? Artists understood that, and they understood that was a way to create the sense of depth. Same thing with those train tracks. Do you see how those parallel lines recede into the distance at the vanishing point? Another way to create the sense of depth. Renaissance artists also wanted to bring back classical idealism. We saw that in ancient Greece, where the sculptors sculpted according to ideal proportions, and did not sculpt people as they really appeared, warts and all, as the saying goes. Renaissance artists also wanted to capture the sense of the individual. Like in ancient Greece, during the Renaissance, the individual was becoming more important in art and in culture. Something else worth noting is that artists could now depict secular themes again. So people were starting to paint portraits again after a very long time. Okay, so the artwork did not have to be religious. It could also be secular now. The first of the artists we're going to introduce here is a man named Giotto, an Italian. And so he's from the pre-Renaissance period, as art historians call it, but we're not really interested in phases in art history or anything like that. Giotto was a very famous and renowned painter for some frescoes that he painted in the city of Padua in the Arena Chapel in the very early 14th century. So he was interested in a great deal of what the Renaissance artists wanted to accomplish, that focus on nature, the focus on the individual. So here we have two paintings, both depicting the same event, the Palm Sunday entrance of Christ into Jerusalem before Holy Week. So the first image, we have a Byzantine interpretation of that event. And do you see how we have the golden sky contrasted with Giotto's interpretation with the blue sky, again, as nature really appears? Do you notice the understanding of space in each painting? Do you see how all those people are crammed into that doorway in the first painting? Did you get the sense that there is, that everything is to scale? Well, of course it's not. And take a look at the people's feet. They're sort of just hovering there, aren't they? Their feet don't rest firmly on the ground. It's almost like they're walking on their tiptoes. That's not how people really get around in the real world, is it? No. Contrast that with the people in Giotto's fresco. The gait is much more to scale. There's much more of an appreciation for space, and the people rest firmly on the ground. Here we have another fresco from the Arena Chapel painted by Giotto. Again, we have the emphasis on nature as it really appears. We have the blue sky. Do you notice how we also see a great deal of emotion here in the Lamentation? A fresco remembering Christ after he had been removed from the cross. Take a look at all of the people present. Do you see the grief and the sorrow? Look at the man in the center. Do you see how he has his arms outstretched as he wails? That's St. John the Evangelist. You see Mary Magdalene at the feet of Christ weeping. They're even joined in their sorrow with the angels in the sky who writhe around and cry with grief. Giotto was a master of emotion, very different from the Byzantine painting of the Madonna and Child we saw earlier, isn't it? Moving on, let's take a look at some of the work of Donatello, one of the great Italian sculptors of the Renaissance. Donatello spent a great deal of time traveling to Rome, where he studied some of the great statues from the classical past. Here we have one of them, his David. Maybe you remember David from our survey of the ancient Near East at the beginning of the course. The David here is not king yet. Here we have the young boy who went out and managed to kill the giant Goliath. You can see this is a sculpture executed in bronze, and something that made it very special indeed is it was the first freestanding life-size nude since the ancient world. Yes, David, a biblical character, is depicted in the nude here, just like those classical Greek sculptures we thought about some weeks ago. We have the sense of movement with this sculpture. Do you see the movement of the legs and how the weight of the body rests on the right leg? Do you see how the sculpture radiates a sense of calm and ideal beauty, very much like Greek sculpture? And this is an intriguing fusion of the Bible and Christianity and pagan art. So Donatello has certainly captured that here. And you remember how I said that people could depict secular themes in their artwork now? We definitely have that in Donatello's Il Gattamelata. That's an equestrian statue, again made out of bronze, that is on display in the city of Padua. Gattamelata was a mercenary captain in Italy. So there we have a monument commemorating a military man. There's nothing religious about this statue at all. It's commemorating and honoring a man. Not God, not a saint, a man. And we might compare this with the statue of Marcus Aurelius from the 2nd century. Presumably, Donatello studied this sculpture, this other equestrian sculpture depicting Emperor Marcus Aurelius, in preparation for sculpting the Gattamelata. Now we come to Leonardo. Leonardo was undoubtedly one of the greatest of the geniuses of the Renaissance. He was a great student of nature and has been seen as the greatest example of a Renaissance man. Maybe you've heard that saying before, Renaissance man. Renaissance man, if someone is a Renaissance man, what that means is they are very knowledgeable and talented in a variety of areas, not just one. So Leonardo was an artist, he was an art theorist, he was a musician, he was a scientist, he was an architect. The man had his hands in a variety of areas and had so many projects going that seldom did he get anything done. But what we have here on the screen is one of his most famous paintings, the Mona Lisa, iconic of the Renaissance and Western civilization. Again, we have a secular portrait here, like the Gattamelata. This is a portrait of a Florentine noblewoman named Lisa. And what's interesting about what Leonardo has done is he has struck an intriguing balance between depicting an individual, yet she has been idealized in the Greek fashion. Take a look at that smile. There's also that strange, ambiguous smile that people have been thinking about for centuries. And it could be that that's based on the so-called archaic smile of some ancient Greek sculptures. You can Google that to see what I'm talking about. Leonardo loved this portrait, and it made its way to France with him, where he spent his last days. Maybe some of you have seen this portrait in person at the Louvre in Paris. Then there's also Leonardo's Last Supper. The Mona Lisa is a small painting, a small portrait. The Last Supper is an enormous mural. So a large wall painting that was painted in a monk's refectory, a cafeteria for religious. I suppose that makes sense, the Last Supper and a cafeteria, that the Last Supper should end up in that particular room rather than another one. You can see the door, or what used to be the door, under Christ and the table. So again, a very large painting. As for iconography here, this is when Christ has announced to the disciples, "One of you will betray me." And everyone's reacting. People are reacting with horror. You can see horror and alarm. As far as what makes this a notable Renaissance painting, take a look at the linear perspective in there. Okay, Leonardo has certainly captured the sense of 3 dimensions. Christ and the apostles look like they are certainly contained within a room. You have the sense that you can go behind them and look out onto a real landscape scene. And how about the individuality? Every apostle looks different and reacts in his own way to Christ's bad news. That was Leonardo's point. He wanted to give each apostle a sense of identity, being an individual. Leonardo also left behind some drawings in his notebooks. So the first one we have here, his Embryo in the Womb, a study of human anatomy. The other drawing is his Vitruvian Man. Maybe you've seen this before. This is Leonardo's study of human proportion. There is also Michelangelo. We cannot forget Michelangelo, another Renaissance man, another very talented individual. What's interesting about him is when we think of Michelangelo, I bet the first thing that comes to mind is the Sistine Chapel, the grandiose paintings at the Vatican. He was a talented painter, but if you were to have asked him himself what he was, he would have said, I am a sculptor. And indeed, he was a very talented sculptor, and the majority of his works are sculptures. Michelangelo was a very difficult person to work with, a very moody person, yet very spiritual at the same time. A lot of these Renaissance figures, very interesting characters. But anyway, the first sculpture we have here is Michelangelo's Pietà. And the Pietà is on display in St. Peter's Basilica, right as one enters into the church. And what we have is the Virgin Mary. She is holding Christ after he has been taken down from the cross. So sort of like that lamentation scene that we saw earlier with Giotto. When we get close, we can see that Michelangelo had a great understanding of human anatomy. Christ's body looks just as the human body ought to look, attention paid to the bones, the muscles, everything. And the way the Virgin's clothes drape is very much like the way people depicted them in the ancient world. Something else that's interesting to note is Mary looks very, very young. She looks like she could be the same age as Christ himself, even though she would have been significantly older. There's that theme of idealization again. And Michelangelo depicted her thus because he wanted to have some sort of visible way to demonstrate the purity of her soul. A lot of Michelangelo's sculptures and works were larger than life, and that is definitely the case with his interpretation of David. Michelangelo's David is enormous. We're talking like 16 feet high. Very different when contrasted with Donatello's interpretation, which is much smaller and looks much more feminine. Michelangelo's David looks like he could be an Olympian god, doesn't he? And when you study the David, you can see there's this pent-up energy. There's this anxiety in with the sculpture. When you get close enough to see the face, you can see that the muscles tighten around the forehead, really giving us some psychological insight into what David is thinking. Donatello's David shows David after he has vanquished the giant. Michelangelo shows us David as he is waiting for the conflict to begin. So it's as if David is watching as Goliath is making his way across the battlefield so the duel can begin. Again, Michelangelo demonstrated a great knowledge of the human body. Look at the muscles, You can even see close up that he has the veins exactly where they belong on David's very large hands. Now, as for painting, Michelangelo was forced by Pope Julius II, another very difficult character, to paint the Sistine ceiling. So the ceiling of that chapel where the cardinals go to elect new popes. There is so much that could be said here, but let's keep it simple. What we have in the center of the ceiling are 9 scenes from Genesis, the biblical book of Genesis, from the creation of the world through the flood of Noah. So that is what Michelangelo depicted in the very center. The most famous panel being the creation of Adam. I bet you've seen this one before, or maybe a close-up of the 2 hands approaching each other. So what we have is Adam on earth. You can see he seems very heavy and very ponderous. And I mean, that's part of the point. He is part of earth, brought forth from the earth. And we have God the Father. It's like he's racing over to Adam. Looks like an Olympian god too. And you can see him stretching out his hand to pass on the spark of life to Adam. Not quite the way it's described in Genesis, where God sculpts Adam, gets him from the earth and breathes life into him. Here, he passes on the spark of life, more of a Greek interpretation of the text. Moving on to architecture, we have 2 examples that give us a sense of what Renaissance architects were trying to accomplish. The first of them being the Church of Sant'Andrea in Mantua in northern Italy, a 15th century project. The Church of Sant'Andrea, and that's the Italian for Andrew, began as a medieval church. But the people in charge wanted a new facade. A new facade means something like face or side built onto the church. So they commissioned the architect and great Renaissance man Alberti, actually a priest, to do the work. So take a look at the facade there on the screen. There we have on this medieval church a temple front, just like Greek architecture. Maybe you remember the Parthenon, and then also the triumphal arch above the door, a very Roman theme. So we have this classical front on a medieval church. One of the most well-known stories relating to Renaissance architecture is that of the dome of the Cathedral of Florence. This church began in the Gothic style in the late 13th century, but the architects were just too ambitious. They created this space for a very large, gigantic dome that, due to the engineering problems, they could never remedy. And so for a long time, the cathedral had no dome, a great shame and embarrassment for the Florentines. But during the Renaissance period, what they did is they commissioned another of the Renaissance geniuses, a man named Filippo Brunelleschi, to solve the problem. Brunelleschi was actually a friend of Donatello, and when Donatello studied sculptures in Rome, undoubtedly Brunelleschi was off on his own studying architecture in Rome. So he was able to figure out how to solve the problem of Florence's dome. So what he did was he created more of an egg-shaped dome and provided proper support inside, and was able to resolve the problem. So you can see in the picture here what the dome looks like. It is absolutely breathtaking. If you get the chance to go to Florence, go up to the Piazzale Michelangelo across from the Dome, and you'll get a beautiful view of the church and all of Florence with so many of the other great buildings. Absolutely beautiful. Well worth a visit to Florence if you haven't already been. The dome of the Florence Cathedral went on to be the largest in Western Europe since the Pantheon, and it's interesting to compare and contrast the two buildings. Presumably, Brunelleschi spent a lot of time studying the Pantheon while in Rome, with his knowledge of the Pantheon and Roman architecture influencing his ability to create the dome of the Florence Cathedral. So this is another opportunity, if you have questions, to leave them and to leave comments below. So feel free to do that. So we are now entering into the final section of our survey of the Renaissance. Thus far, we have focused exclusively on Italy. Well, not all of the important things related to the Renaissance took place there. It was surely the birthplace of the Renaissance, but the Renaissance traveled beyond Italy, so into places like Spain and France and Germany and England, the Netherlands, other places, and historians call this the Northern Renaissance, the Renaissance beyond the Alps. Really important developments came into being during the Northern Renaissance, one being the printing press. Do you remember which civilization we've studied so far already had a system of printing? If you remember China, good for you. That's exactly correct. You can look back to the post-classical lectures to see how they were able to do printing. But anyway, we're looking at something a little different here. So what happened in Germany in the 15th century was they introduced movable lead type. And with this movable lead type in the printing shops, and take a look at the picture of the printing shop there, what they are inking and applying the ink to is the movable lead type. So with this contraption, the printing press, people could print many copies of a book very quickly, very efficiently. And the German person who has been credited with the invention of the printing press was a man named Johann Gutenberg. Maybe you've heard of the Gutenberg Bible before. We're talking about the same individual. I cannot emphasize enough what a huge impact the printing press had on Western Europe. I remember, and I'm old enough to remember, when the internet first came out in the early and mid-90s. It was quite the revolution. Okay, the idea that you could send an email to someone halfway across the world and it gets there in just a few moments. The printing press did something similar, something revolutionary during the time of the Renaissance. Ideas could now spread very quickly, and it was very difficult to stop the ideas from spreading once they had been made known. Martin Luther, the Protestant reformer, made a lot of use. Used the printing press a great deal. That's how he was able to get his ideas out so successfully. With more books circulating, more people were learning how to read. And very nice for Europeans who used to have to spend like a year's wages to buy a book. Books now with the printing press were much cheaper. Very, very important, the printing press. We saw humanism in Italy, right? That emphasis on the study of the content of classical learning. Well, humanists in the North were also interested in the classics, don't get me wrong, but there was much more of a religious dimension to what they were doing, to the point where scholars have referred to humanism in Northern Europe as Christian humanism. People were interested in not only Latin and Greek, but also Hebrew, the original language of the Old Testament. The writing on the screen here on the slide is Hebrew script. Good luck trying to read it. Northern humanists were very concerned with the spiritual well-being of not only themselves, but also the church, which they were concerned was becoming corrupt. It had strayed from its original ideas. So a lot of these humanists spoke out against the corruption in the church hierarchy at the time. I'm going to introduce two of these individuals to you. The first being Erasmus of Rotterdam. Erasmus was coming from the Netherlands. He was Dutch and was well known in Western Europe. He was a celebrity. People loved to read his writings and to spend time with him. He was so talented when it came to the classics that he was referred to as the Prince of Humanists and has been seen as the greatest among the humanists. We could go on and on talking about Erasmus. We're not going to. Instead, I'm just going to introduce to you two of his works that fit in with Northern humanism. The first being his In Praise of Folly. In Praise of Folly is what we would call satire. So it's the kind of writing that pokes fun at people's vices. What Erasmus did in this particular text is he made fun of people in the church, people in government, people in the schools, the universities, in an effort to bring out the corruptions that he saw. But he pointed out the corruptions and the abuses in such a way that it was like he was making fun of them rather than doing what Luther would do later on, which was a whole-scale assault on the church. Erasmus never went that far, although he certainly did call attention to the corruptions he saw in the hierarchy with the bishops, the popes, so on and so forth. He was also influential for the publishing of the Greek New Testament, a critical edition of the Greek New Testament. And when I say critical here, you may be thinking, oh, what does that mean? Did he say bad things about the New Testament in the Greek form or something like that? Did he criticize it? No, that's not quite what we mean by critical here. What we mean is Erasmus did the work to get back to the purest form of the Greek New Testament. So he published it, and this became an invaluable tool for scholars of the Bible, looking to get back to the New Testament in its original language. And we also have Sir Thomas More. Erasmus was Dutch, More was English, and was a highly influential figure in English government during the early decades of the 16th century. Politicians have a bad rap nowadays, as do lawyers. More had also been a lawyer. I can't think of two people that people tend to speak more harshly about. But More, believe it or not, was a moral man and a man of integrity. One of the few that I can introduce to you in this course. He was a very religious and devout Catholic. He actually thought a great deal about entering the monastic life before he decided on becoming a politician, but he remained devout and a person of integrity, even as he had to wade into the mire of politics. He was a significant Northern humanist. Humanists love to write about history. More was no different. He wrote a great deal about the English past. His most famous writing was Utopia. Utopia was published in 1516, the same year that Erasmus published the critical edition of the New Testament. And here, More, like Erasmus, was speaking out against the corruptions that he saw in society. The first part of the book criticized what More saw as abuses in Tudor England, political and social abuses. And when I say Tudor England, I'm talking about Henry VIII and Queen Elizabeth and that crowd. More on them later on. So he explained in the first half everything that was wrong with society. And then in the second half, he said, okay, everyone, now let's try to imagine what the ideal society would look like on the island of Utopia. So this ideal place that doesn't exist. So he explained what the social arrangements would be there and explained how it would be wonderful if that were the case in his own country and in his own time. So a very different approach from that of Machiavelli, right? Machiavelli was very blunt. Hey, you're going to have to do bad things in order to get ahead. More was more interested on the shoulds and the woulds and all of that, the ideal. Some great things were going on in the world of art in Northern Europe. Frescoes were very popular in Italy, oil painting more popular in Northern Europe. Oil painting became very important for a variety of reasons. Oil paints made color much more vibrant and strong. With oil paints, artists, painters were also able to capture very, very small details in their painting. Details that had just not been possible with fresco painting. One of the significant painters of Northern Europe was a man from Flanders, that's what Flemish means on the screen, named Jan van Eyck. Perhaps you've seen this portrait, the Arnolfini portrait, before. It's one of the, again, another iconic portrait from the Renaissance, painted in the early 15th century. What we have is a secular portrait of the Italian banker Giovanni Arnolfini and his wife Giovanna. So they have been betrothed, they were going to get married, and Van Eyck has painted this portrait of them, commemorating the betrothal. Remember, this is an oil painting, and we can see all sorts of details here. Small, minute details. Take a look at the mirror on the wall in the background. Van Eyck was able to capture his self-portrait in the mirror. He was even able to depict scenes of the Passion of Christ in the different areas beyond where the actual mirror is. So these different scenes from the Passion. On that small mirror, take a look at the knobs on the chandelier. Again, very small details depicted with clarity. Do you remember that term linear perspective? That sense of, that attempt to create the illusion of three dimensions? We have that here, don't we? This may be a secular portrait, but there's also spiritual religious symbolism in here. Turn your attention to the shoes and the dog in the scene. The shoes on the floor are not demonstrating that these two are slobs, and the dog does not necessarily demonstrate that they're dog lovers. They actually symbolize something. Have you ever heard the story of Moses before in the Old Testament? He appeared before the burning bush, and God said to him, Remove your sandals, you are on holy ground. Well, the shoes are removed here in order to demonstrate the sanctity of marriage. And then what about the dog? How about, have you heard the name Fido for a dog before? That comes from the Latin word for fidelity and loyalty. Of course, that's also important in a marriage, isn't it? That's why the shoes and the dog appear here. And as we're coming to as we're starting to approach the end of our survey of the Renaissance, we also cannot help but to speak of the developments in the English language. You may already be familiar that the English that people spoke at this point in time in the 1500s and the 1600s and 1700s is different in some respects from the English we speak nowadays. English evolved a great deal in its history. Old English looked completely different from the English we speak nowadays, completely different. And English continued to evolve until we have gotten where we are now. The greatest English writer was undoubtedly the playwright William Shakespeare. And so there we have his portrait there. And Shakespeare was based at the Globe Theatre in London, which has been rebuilt, and you can go and visit and watch plays. Shakespeare in his time was responsible for 37 plays. A lot of them, or a good number of them anyway, I bet you have heard of or maybe read in school. So Romeo and Juliet, Macbeth, Hamlet, Julius Caesar, Othello, the list goes on and on. But fitting in with this theme of the Renaissance, some of these plays take place in the Roman past and include figures such as Julius Caesar, Cleopatra. They take place in Italy, like Romeo and Juliet. Remember, Italy was the home of the Renaissance. And then also in England's own past. So we saw previously with Thomas More how important the past was for humanists. A lot of Shakespeare's plays have been turned into movies. So here are two of them. If you're interested in the play Hamlet, maybe check out Mel Gibson's Hamlet from the early 90s. So Mel Gibson played Hamlet. Helena Bonham Carter, who very often seems to end up dying horrible deaths in her movies, plays Ophelia. And then there's also this older interpretation of Romeo and Juliet starring Leonardo DiCaprio and Claire Danes. They kept the original Shakespearean English dialogue while giving everybody more updated costumes. So it's a very interesting interpretation if you're interested in that kind of thing. And so now is the opportunity, if you have any questions, to let me know. And with that, we come to the conclusion of our survey of the Renaissance. For the next class period, we will have our survey of European expansion that is coming along, that will be coming along shortly.